Ladies, gentlemen, and haradrim of all ages, with the new season and the expansion release, there were quite a few new things added to Diablo 4, and among these there were quite a few new mythic unique items, the rarest types of items in the entire game, with either significant luck required to have one drop, or an exorbitant price to actually craft one. So when it comes to these items, it is important to know which ones are good and which ones are bad, which is of course even more of a question mark with the new ones, as there just hasn't been a whole lot of time yet to actually test them. With this then, there are two specific new mythic uniques that were essentially created for Spiritborn. One literally is only usable by Spiritborn players, the other, however, is shared with Barbarian and Druid because it's a polearm, though realistically it would be much less likely to be used by Barbarian because one of its main draws is it gives you a way to get the berserking buff, which Barbarian already has lots of, so it doesn't really help them too much. So it's really just for Spiritborn and Druid more than anything else. So today we're going to talk about these two mythic uniques, how they relate to Spiritborn in general, but also the reasoning for why I've sort of placed them how I do in general compared to others. First, let's talk about the less specific mythic between them, which is Shattered Vow. This is a polearm. The implicit affix on this is bonus damage to healthy enemies, which is fine but not fantastic. The unique effect makes it so any enemy that is poisoned for a larger amount than their remaining life gets immediately executed. This sort of speeds up the effectiveness of a damage over time fully focused build by making it have much more pop, so when you actually have applied enough poison, enemies just died instead of having to wait for the full duration to actually take them down. But for this to work, you need to be stacking pure poison, and a lot of builds are more made to build poison towards a specific goal, like popping it with Noxious Resonance as an example. Especially for Spiritborn as a class, we have so many different ways of boosting our crit damage and crits in general that it feels almost criminal to not lean into the synergy between poison and crit. But if you do that, it makes this unique effect just completely meaningless because you're popping the poison damage anyways, which means that you will never reach a point where the poison exceeds the remaining life that you wouldn't have been able to just do that damage regardless. The affixes on this, however, are the potential saving grace for the weapon. This gives a nice big pile of maximum life, which is excellent for Spiritborn, especially right now, as long as the viscous shield paragon bug persists, because basically this just increases your damage ridiculously as you gain more maximum life, with essentially uncapped scaling on that effect as long as you also have barriers being created. But then importantly, it has the lucky hit chance to become berserking. This is effectively a 25% damage increase multiplier to everything that we do, and 30% movement speed increase too while active. And as we aren't barbarians, this is our only way to access this actual buff. So this is a pretty solid bonus in itself if you just look into this specific part of the weapon. As well, the weapon has an affix to increase attack speed while you're berserking, which is a further solid synergy with this. Then finally, just a nice hefty additive damage over time increase. After testing with this a fair amount for Spiritborn, I simply cannot think of a situation where I would want to use this really. At least not with the current balancing of things like the redirected force aspect scaling crit damage to a point that it just feels criminal to not use Noxious Resonance in a poison-focused build, which then makes the unique effect just completely irrelevant once again, and makes the weapon essentially just before the 25% damage multiplier based off lucky hit chance, some attack speed, a chunk of maximum life, and then some additive damage over time and damage to healthy enemies. For your two-handed weapon slot, which is the most important slot on the character, that is just not at all worth replacing either a unique weapon if you want to do something like a funky Kepaleke poison mix like you can with Touch of Death, or even a legendary weapon for something like Stinger, as you just stand to gain way more simply using a legendary weapon with double effectiveness legendary aspect on it in doing poison builds based around that, and more personally chosen and cherry-picked affixes too. This makes the mythic unique here sort of just bad at the moment, in my personal opinion. Of course, there could be some unknown interaction, some unforeseen sort of combination that changes this in the future, but as of the immediate moment, there just isn't a Spiritborn build that I can think of that improves from using this weapon unless you purposefully build completely around it, and if you do that, it just still won't give you a whole lot of damage as a reward compared to the other things that Spiritborn can do right now. Then we have our second weapon of the day, Nesekem the Herald. This is the Spiritborn exclusive mythic unique. It is a glaive, which means no other class can wield it, and this one has an interesting effect, but in the end, it's just a bit too restrictive. The implicit affix on the weapon is a bunch of bonus damage to elites, which is pretty much always appreciated. It's a very good stat. The affixes on the weapon itself are solid too, being all stats, maximum life, which we already talked about being great, and then just a large chunk of both additive critical strike damage and additive overpower damage. These tie into the unique effect of the weapon itself, which is every 5 seconds a random nearby enemy becomes marked. Marked enemies are vulnerable, as well as having your attacks guaranteed to crit and overpower them every time. The problem with this is the last little bit of text here at the end, which is hitting a marked enemy 10 times clears the mark from them. That essentially makes this a poor man's version of the Rod of Kepaleke and Banished Lord's Talisman combo that causes guaranteed crits and overpowers, but without that restriction, and also offering tons of extra damage bonuses on top of just doing those effects. Except, obviously, calling this the poor man's version of anything is also sort of hilarious because it is a mythic unique item. Even if we stop comparing to Kepaleke and Banished Lords though, maybe let's pretend that we want to do a build that doesn't focus on core basic skills, so that combo just wouldn't work for us, and instead we want to do something like a concussive stomp based build, or an ultimate skill based build. Well, then we still come to a somewhat similar problem. 10 hits in 5 seconds is just absolutely not enough, because pretty much every build is designed to hit more often than that in the game, and when the effect of the weapon becomes inconsistent, it becomes extremely not worth using anymore, with again regular legendary weapons and just other unique weapons for Spiritborn being much more usable for this class. And this one is a bit more egregious though, because the only class that you'd have to balance the weapon around is Spiritborn. You don't have to consider anything else. So having it be worse than the other options that Spiritborn has is relatively unfortunate, because you could pretty much predict this happening just by looking at the effect. That said, my main question for this weapon is, why doesn't the effect just work like Inner Sight does for rogues? Have it apply to one enemy for 5 seconds, don't give it a 10 hit limit like you have done here, and if an enemy dies, then move the mark to a new enemy. If they don't die, switch it anyways after a few seconds just to make it more interesting still. This way it would have a unique effect in any build capable of echoing damage to other enemies from a singular hit. Maybe something like Stinger or Bristling Vengeance, making payback echo forwards, so you could take the enemy that is guaranteed to be crit and overpowered and spread that guaranteed effect around to an AoE. That would be fun, almost like a challenge or a puzzle to make a build around specifically turning single target hits into multi-target damage to take advantage of this effect a bit better. And then it would of course just be great for bosses too, where you would be guaranteed to just have a single target fight, which means you can just funnel everything into those effects. Right now, however, it just has a very simple issue, which is that no respectable build wants to hit less than 2 times per second. It's just not feasible. If you hit enemies more than twice per second, there's also just no way to keep this buff active permanently. You will run out of crits and overpowers, which sort of just ruins the whole point of it. And that's on top of it only applying to one enemy at a time with the Mark II, which at that point just sort of pigeonholes you too much and asks you to build your way out of a very, very deep hole to take advantage of the buff and make it worth it. And when you can achieve a similar effect to this with far less specificity or much less conditional parts involved to doing something like this, like the Brood of Kepaleke and Banished Lords combo, it just makes this item completely feel pointless in its current state. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A sort of discussion and review of the new mythic unique weapons this season, with a focus around how they work and how they are for Spiritborn as a class, with the short answer being that right now they just aren't really worth using over multiple other options like uniques or legendaries in the slot that are also easier to get. So my recommendation is, do not use your Resplendent Sparks to craft these items. If you can instead use them for something much more generally useful, like the Ring of Starless Skies or the new Shroud of False Death chest piece, which has a ton of damage and survivability to the chest piece slot for Spiritborn. Of course, if you aren't forced into using something like Jacinth Shell otherwise in that slot already in your build. I hope you've enjoyed this then, and if you have any other ideas for how these mythics might find a proper build to be worked into, then of course feel free to let me know down in the comments, and I'll mess around with it and let you know if it works. But as it stands currently, these two weapons just seem a little bit underwhelming for Spiritborn. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.